Night falls swiftly in the valley, descending like a velvet shroud. The wind stirs, gentle at first, but with a hidden sharpness that creeps beneath thatched roofs and rattles wooden shutters. The distant forest murmurs, branches whispering secrets too old for human tongues. In the small village of Heddle, every lamp burns low, casting trembling shadows on the rough stone walls. The hush that settles is not the quiet of peace, but the weight of anxious expectation. Somewhere, a dog howls a thin, mournful sound that rises, wavers, and dies. In the darkness, the villagers huddle close, their voices barely more than a rustle, like dry leaves in the wind. Mothers draw their children near, the men sit by their hearths, wary, eyes flickering from fire to window, as if expecting some shapeless threat to drift in with the night air. They speak in whispers tonight, because this is a night unlike others. Tonight, the old fears have awakened the fear of sickness, the fear of madness, the fear of the unknown. The fields have yielded their harvest, but a blight has touched the grain. The cattle have grown restless, their eyes too bright, their breathing rough. And then there are the story-strange dreams, sudden violence, people wandering at midnight, weeping or laughing at things unseen. At the edge of the village, where the shadows gather thickest, stands a cottage, its windows aglow with flickering candlelight. The villagers call it the healer's house. Some say it is a place of hope, others a nest of danger. Its mistress, Mira, is a stranger among them, her hair dark as raven's wing, her accent foreign, her knowledge both blessing and curse. Some whisper that she carries secrets from distant lands. Others believe she walks with spirits, that her hands heal and harm in equal measure. Tonight, as the moon climbs higher, pale and watchful, fear coils through every alley and lane. Rumors scuttle like rats from door to door. Who will fall next to the sickness? Who will lose their mind? Who will the priest blame at dawn? Each face at the window reflects the same silent question, a question no one dares to speak aloud. Who brought this curse to our home? The wind presses harder against the doors, and the village holds its breath. Somewhere, beyond the trembling candlelight, Mira stands by her window. She feels the weight of 100 eyes pressing through the night. She knows the fear, and she knows its target. Tonight, the healer is both the village's last hope and its chosen scapegoat. This is the night of whispers. This is where the story begins. Dawn in Heddle is a slow, grey stirring. The mist lingers across the meadows, veiling the fields and the mossy roofs with a shroud that muffles sound and flattens colour. Only when the church bell tolls, thin and brittle, does the village truly wake men rising from their beds with stiff backs, women stoking embers for porridge, children blinking in the chilly half-light. Heddle is not a place that welcomes change. The same families have lived here for generations, their stories bound together by shared hardship, harvest, and rumour. News from the outside world comes rarely and is greeted with suspicion. In Heddle, the past is a presence as real as the cracked stones beneath their feet. Most believe that nothing truly new can happen here. But lately, strange things have unsettled the village's careful order. It began as small disturbances. A dog found wandering in circles at dawn, its eyes glazed and wild. A child who would not speak, who sat by the hearth with trembling hands, refusing to eat. An old man waking his neighbours with wordless screams, sweat slicking his brow, his gaze unfocused and haunted. At first, people blamed the weather, the early frost, the restless wind, the heavy clouds that pressed low over the valley. Then they whispered of omens, the crows gathering in the square, the cat that vanished, leaving only a patch of black fur behind the church. Someone remembered the last time sickness swept through Heddle, 30 years before, and how it carried away a dozen souls before it burned itself out. By the time the priest, Father Soren, gave a sermon on the dangers of pride and the need for repentance, the whispers had become sharp and urgent. Mothers forbade their children from playing in the woods. Neighbours eyed each other with new wariness. Even the headman, a man slow to speak and slower to act, locked his doors at dusk. Through it all, Mira moved quietly, as she always had since arriving 2 years ago. She kept to herself, tending her small garden and mixing potions from herbs gathered in the forest. The villagers came to her when they were desperate, when the doctor from the city could not be summoned, when prayers failed to bring relief. Some left with gratitude, others with new suspicions. Mira knew how they saw her, the stranger, the outsider, her hair too dark, her eyes too sharp, her hands too skilled. She had grown accustomed to their glances, to the way children peered from behind skirts as she passed, to the murmured words that trailed after her on market days. She had learned long ago that kindness in such places is a double-edged gift. One morning, Mira found a young woman on her doorstep, clutching a ragged bundle to her chest. The woman's cheeks were raw with cold, her eyes wide with terror. "Please," she whispered, barely louder than the breeze. "Help my son. He's not right. He sees things. He won't eat. He says the shadows talk to him at night." Mira drew the mother and boy inside, offering them a seat by the fire and a cup of hot water steeped with chamomile and mint. The boy sat silent, staring into the flames, fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. His skin was pale, his lips cracked. Mira knelt in front of him, her voice soft and steady. "Can you tell me what you see?" she asked gently. The boy did not look up. "The moon," he murmured. "It's too close. Sometimes it comes into my room. It whispers things I don't understand." Mira's heart tightened. She pressed a hand to his forehead, checked his pulse, asked him to open his mouth and say, "Ah." The signs were troubling but not unfamiliar. She had seen such symptoms before, in other places. A sickness of the mind, or sometimes a sickness of the body that clouded thought and bent reality. To the mother, Mira offered reassurance, a tonic of valerian and honey, a poultice of feverfew and thyme, but as she watched them depart, the old unease crept in. This was not the first case, and she doubted it would be the last. In the days that followed, more an old woman plagued by nightmares, a farmhand prone to sudden fits of weeping, a sturdy labourer who trembled uncontrollably when the sun set. Mira treated each with what knowledge she had, but the results were mixed. Some improved, some did not. In the tavern, talk turned to darker possibilities. "It's the devil's work," grumbled a carpenter, clutching his mug. "Or the old curse. My grandfather said it would come back," replied the cooper's wife. Father Soren visited the afflicted and offered prayers, sprinkling holy water on their doorsteps. The headman sent for a city doctor, but word came back that no one could be spared. The sickness was everywhere, not just in Heddle. At the market, Mira felt eyes burning holes in her back. The butcher's apprentice spat when she walked past. A mother drew her daughter away, whispering too loudly, "Don't look at her, she's bad luck." But still, in the deepest night, when the rest of the village shivered in their beds, Mira sat by her fire, grinding dried roots, reading her battered book by the light of a single candle. She would not abandon these people, even if they chose to abandon her. She had seen real darkness before, and she knew this was only the beginning. Days in Heddle moved at the pace of the sun, slow and circular, as if nothing in the world could change except the seasons. Mira measured her hours by the tasks at hand, crushing herbs with her mortar and pestle, boiling water for tinctures, hanging bundles of lavender and sage from the rafters. Her small home at the edge of the woods was always filled with the mingled scents of earth and smoke, dried flowers and sharp green leaves. She kept her space tidy out of habit, though the villagers rarely noticed. To them, her home was a place of uneasy magic, too many jars with unreadable labels, too many books in strange alphabets. Children dared each other to peek through her windows and run, shrieking, when Mira caught them and smiled. It was in this modest cottage that Mira found her rare moments of peace. Here, no one cared where she came from, or why she never spoke of family or past loves. Here, she could allow herself to remember. The sea, restless and blue, beyond the city of her birth. The voice of her mother, teaching her the names of plants, the secret ways that willow bark soothed a fever or mint calmed a stomach. Sometimes at dusk she would sit by the window and watch the villagers tending their animals, patching fences, mending boots. Their lives seemed so simple, so safe until the sickness had come. One evening, as Mira was tending her garden, a small figure crept along the fence. The child wore a dress too thin for autumn, her feet bare and dirty, hair tangled about her shoulders. Mira watched without speaking, recognizing the wariness in the girl's stance. Finally, the child spoke, voice little more than a rasp. "Are you the witch?" Mira laughed softly. "People call me many things, but I think of myself as a healer." "And you?" The girl did not answer at first. She kept her hands behind her back, eyes darting from Mira's face to the herbs and back again. "My name is Lise," she said at last. "My mother is gone. My uncle says I'm trouble." Mira set aside her trowel. "Are you hungry?" A nod, quick and small. Mira led her inside, where a pot of barley porridge simmered over the coals. She poured Lise a bowl and set it on the table, offering bread and honey. The girl ate with silent intensity, glancing up now and then, as if expecting the food to vanish. When she finished, Mira washed the bowl and handed Lise a clean rag for her hands. The child stared at the neat bundle of linen, then at Mira, confusion warring with gratitude. "You can come here when you need to," Mira said gently. "No questions, no trouble." Lise slipped out the door like a shadow, but from that night, Mira sometimes found small offerings on her doorstep, a feather, a wildflower, a handful of berries, silent tokens of thanks. As autumn deepened, Mira noticed the villagers growing more restless. The harvest was poor. Cattle bellowed at night for no reason. Men argued over small matters at the tavern. An old superstition resurfaced, that when the moon hung low and red, evil slipped into the world. Mira heard whispers about herself in the market. "She doesn't pray like we do. Why does she walk in the woods alone? Remember the stories from last year, that cat, the stillborn lambs." The gossip grew, feeding on fear and uncertainty. When a new case of madness appeared, a woman found wandering, shrieking, clutching her head, the village's unease sharpened. The priest spoke of spiritual dangers. The headman warned against outsiders with strange ways. One afternoon, as Mira was gathering willow bark at the river's edge, a man approached broad-shouldered, rough hands, wary eyes. She recognized him as Halvard, the woodsman, known for his silence and strength. He stood at a distance, not meeting her gaze. "You help Lise." Mira nodded. "She comes for food and company." "She says you're kind," Halvard said quietly. "Some don't believe it." Mira met his eyes, unflinching. "Kindness is not a crime." Halvard shifted his weight. "If you need wood, or anything, let me know." It was a small offer, but it warmed her. She sensed in Halvard a quiet understanding, the loneliness of a man apart. That night, as the wind howled through the trees and the village shutters slammed shut, Mira sat by her fire with Lise and Halvard. They spoke little, sharing warmth and bread. In the silence, Mira felt, if only for an hour, almost at home. Yet for every moment of peace the pressure outside grew. A child fell sick with fever and strange dreams. A farmer's wife swore her cow spoke to her in Latin. The old men gathered in the square, muttering about omens and retribution. In the darkness, even the stars seemed less certain. Mira wondered how long her fragile refuge could hold. The approach of the autumn festival was usually a time of preparation and mild joy. Every year, the villagers gathered to give thanks for the harvest, even if the bounty was meager. This year, the usual mood was absent. Faces in the square were drawn and pinched, laughter forced, the market stalls half-stocked. Mira watched from the edge, her basket heavy with roots and late apples. The priest, Father Soren, led a solemn procession to the church, blessing each house with holy water, pausing at Mira's gate longer than at any other. His gaze was fixed, unreadable, as if measuring something only he could see. The children trailed behind, some sneaking glances at Mira and then giggling nervously, others gripping their mother's hands. That night Mira sat on her step, listening to the distant music and snatches of hymn. She missed her own festival's noisy, wild affairs where neighbours gathered in the square to sing, dance, and feast. She remembered the scent of roasting chestnuts, the sparkle of lanterns, her mother's arm warm around her shoulders. Her nostalgia was interrupted by a sharp tap at her door. Lise slipped in, cheeks flushed from running. "They're talking about you," the girl whispered. "They said you cursed the grain. That's why people are sick." Myra let the words hang in the air. Who said this? Lise shook her head, eyes wide with fear. Everyone. For a moment Mira felt the old ache of Exilia's sense of being set apart, marked as different, watched with suspicion. She tried to reassure the child, but she knew how quickly rumour could turn to accusation, especially when the world offered no easy answers. A day later, a strange gift appeared at Mira's doorstep, a bundle wrapped in cloth containing a single white feather, a scrap of bread, and a sprig of rosemary. Mira recognized the items as Tokensa message. In her mother's tradition, such a gift was a silent plea for protection, or perhaps a warning. Someone in the village was afraid, but also hopeful. It was a sign that not all hearts had turned against her. The next morning the festival dawned with chill rain. Mira stayed inside, tending her patients and brewing medicines. She treated a feverish boy whose mother would not meet her eyes, and an old man whose hands trembled so badly he could no longer feed himself. The symptoms were always the same: confusion, fear, restless sleep. Mira wondered if the illness was spreading through the grain, or water, or simply through the minder contagion of dread. Halvard stopped by in the afternoon, leaving a bundle of firewood by her door. He didn't come inside, but lingered under the eaves, watching the rain. "People are scared," he said simply. "Some blame you." Mira sighed. "Fear looks for an easy target. I've seen it before." He nodded. "If trouble comes, I can help." It was the closest thing to a promise Mira had heard in many months. On the final night of the festival, Mira watched from her window as villagers danced around the bonfire, their faces red from heat and ale. The flames cast wild shadows, making saints into monsters, friends into strangers. Mira felt the separation keenly. She wanted to step outside, to join them, to forget the burden of being always other. But she knew better. Suddenly, a figure detached from the circle and approached her cottage, stumbling through the mud. It was the baker's wife, Marta, her face streaked with tears. "Please," Marta begged at the door. "My husband, he's not himself. He's shouting at shadows. He says there are voices in the wheat." Mira hurried to follow. The baker, usually a jovial man, was pacing the floor of his small house, muttering curses and swatting at invisible flies. His eyes were wild, lips flecked with foam. Marta hovered, wringing her hands, whispering prayers. Mira approached the baker cautiously, speaking his name, coaxing him to sit. She checked his pulse, pressed a cool cloth to his brow, tried to ease his terror with soft words and valerian drops. But the man's mind was far away, caught in some private storm. After an hour, exhausted, Mira left Marta with instructions and a sachet of calming herbs. Outside, the night was thick and silent. Somewhere, a rooster crowed, hours before dawn. As Mira walked home, she felt eyes watching from behind curtains, whispers following in her wake. She quickened her pace. In the cold, her breath rose like smoke. By morning, the village awoke to new fear. Rumours spread quickly. "The baker is mad. Mira was with him last night. She brings bad luck." The pattern was familiar, as old as humanity itself, but that knowledge brought little comfort. Mira set a pot to boil and sat, hands wrapped around her cup, listening to the wind. She thought of all the places she'd left behind, all the times she had tried to help and found only suspicion. She wondered if she would have the strength to stay, or if the time had come to move on. Then Lise appeared at her window, pressing her palm to the glass, eyes bright with silent plea, and Mira knew, for now, at least, she would stay. The days grew shorter, the sick grew no better, and the whisper of dread became a constant hum in every household. The baker raved at night, and in the mornings his wife was seen in the square, her face pale and bruised with worry, clutching her daughter close. More children began to mutter of strange dreams, of shadows crawling across their walls, of voices calling to them in the hour before dawn. The council met twice in 1 week, an unheard-of thing. The headman's voice was low and grave, urging calm, but each speaker who rose after him sounded more anxious than the last. "It is in the bread," insisted one. "No, in the air," said another. A third shook his fist toward Mira's cottage. "She came here and the sickness followed. Before her, our harvests were good, our children strong." Father saw and listened, saying little, his eyes always drawn to the back of the hall, where shadows pooled. After the meeting, Mira found her path home blocked by a cluster of villagers. None spoke, but their stares were heavy with accusation. She kept her chin high, she would not show fear. At her cottage, she worked late by candlelight, mixing teas and balms, turning over every possible cause in her mind. She wrote in her journal, lines in her mother's language, lists of symptoms, times, the weather, notes about the pattern of illness. Nothing made sense. Yet the rhythm of her work measure, pour, grind, steep, gave her a little peace. Halvard knocked quietly at her door, bringing game from the forest. "They say I should stay away," he said, setting the meat on her table, "but I know better." Mira offered him a smile, tired but grateful. "Thank you, I'll make stew." He lingered, watching the fire flicker. "There will be a reckoning soon," he said, almost apologetic. "People are frightened. Frightened people do foolish things." Mira nodded, her eyes on the flames. "I have seen it before." He said nothing more, only pressed her hand and slipped out into the night. Later, as Mira prepared for bed, she heard a faint scratching at the door. She opened it to find Lise, shivering, eyes wide with fear. "They're saying you'll be taken before the priest," Lise whispered, clutching Mira's skirt. They say you're the cause." Mira bent and hugged the child, whispering a promise she was not sure she could keep. "Whatever happens, you are not alone." They sat together in silence until Lise's breathing slowed and her eyes drifted shut. Mira watched over her, thinking of her own childhood of nights spent waiting for daylight, for safety, for hope. Outside, the village was wrapped in a thick, uneasy quiet. Smoke rose in thin threads from the rooftops. The moon hung low, rimmed with red. Somewhere in the fields, a wolf howled. Mira closed her eyes and breathed deep. She would not run. She would not yield to fear, nor abandon the ones who needed her. She was a healer. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it. In the pre-dawn, just before sleep finally claimed her, Mira dreamed of fire and water, of voices calling her name, of a path through the woods that led into a darkness she did not yet understand. The night of whispers was not over. It was only just beginning. Mira's cottage sat at the edge of the woods, a humble refuge both inside and out. The roof was patched with moss and lichen, the stones in the wall gathered from the riverbank. The path to her door was never quite the same from 1 week to the next, sometimes marked by muddy footprints, sometimes swept clean by the wind. Inside, the space felt timeless. Dried bundles of sage, lavender, and yarrow hung from the rafters, casting sharp herbal scents into the air. Shelves were lined with bottles and clay pots, some labelled in neat script, others marked only with mysterious symbols from a language no villager could read. A battered wooden table sat beneath the window, always cluttered with the debris of daily labour, scraps of linen, twisted roots, a feather quill blackened by years of ink. Here Mira found her rhythm. She rose before the sun, swept ashes from the hearth, and set water to boil. Her hands, strong from years of work, moved with silent purpose-shopping, crushing, mixing, pouring. The cottage was never quiet. Even when she worked alone, she spoke softly to herself, as if repeating an ancient charm. Sometimes Lise appeared at dawn, peeking in with wary eyes until Mira waved her inside. The girl had become a near-constant companion, silent when others were near, but full of questions when the two were alone. "Why do you dry so many different plants?" Lise asked one morning, fingering a bundle of rue. Mira smiled. "Every plant has its use. Rue for fever, lavender for bad dreams, yarrow for wounds." "And this?" Lise pointed at a jar of strange grey powder. "That's willow bark," Mira said, remembering her mother's hands sorting the bitter shavings. "It helps with pain. My mother taught me how to make it into tea." Lisa's fingers lingered on the jar. "My uncle says only witches know so much about herbs." "Many healers are called witches, child, especially by those who do not understand them." Lise nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. She seemed older than her years, old enough to carry worry as easily as a basket of kindling. On market days, Mira ventured into the village, her cloak wrapped tight against the wind, her basket loaded with ointments and dried flowers. Some villagers met her eyes and offered polite, guarded greetings. Others turned away, pretending not to see. She sold her wares to those desperate enough to try anything: women whose children coughed through the night, men whose backs ached after years in the fields, elders who feared the shadows that gathered as dusk fell. Mira took their coins and their stories, offering gentle advice along with each packet and vial. Occasionally she treated small wounds at the market stall: splinters, scrapes, burns from kitchen fires. She worked quickly, never lingering longer than necessary. Even so, she felt the eyes on her, measuring her every gesture, noting every word. Rumors moved faster than the wind. Mira heard herself described as everything from a saint to a serpent. It was not new, and she wore the villagers' fear like an old coat, familiar, heavy, and impossible to shrug off. One afternoon, as Mira packed away the last of her goods, she was approached by the widow Edda. Edda was an imposing woman, tall and spare, with iron-grey hair pulled tight from her face. "My boy is sick," Edda said, her tone brusque. "He dreams of fire. He screams at night. Nothing calms him." Mira met Edda's gaze. "Has he eaten well? Drunk clean water? Did you change his bedding?" Edda's expression softened a little. "He is not hungry. He only stares. His hands shake." "I will come this evening," Mira said. That night, she found Edda's son curled in a blanket, eyes wide and wild. Mira checked his pulse, examined his throat, asked him gentle questions. The boy answered only in whispers, describing shapes in the dark and the feeling of drowning in cold water. Mira brewed a tea with valerian and mint, coaxed the boy to drink, then sat by his side, humming an old lullaby from her childhood. She watched the fear slowly ease from his eyes, if only for a while. Before she left, Edda pressed a coin into Mira's hand. "You are not like the rest of us," she said, "but you do good work." "Thank you," Mira replied, her voice soft. Late that night, as Mira washed her hands at the basin, she caught her own reflection in the cracked mirror. Dark hair loose, eyes shadowed, hands stained with herb and ink. She looked nothing like the girl. She once was the girl who had dreamed of traveling to distant cities, of learning from the greatest healers in the world. She wondered, not for the first time, if she had done right by coming here. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. In her heart, Mira knew she could not leave, not yet, not while there were still people who needed her. In the quiet hours before dawn, Mira often found herself drifting between memory and waking. The world outside was muted, just the soft creak of rafters, the distant hoot of an owl, and Lisa's steady breath from the little cot by the fire. Sometimes, Mira's dreams took her back to her childhood home by the sea, the scent of salt and wild roses, her mother's laughter as they foraged along the cliffs, the endless blue horizon, promising a life of possibility. But waking always brought her back to Heddle. Here, life was narrower, every day pressed into the shape of need and suspicion. She missed the openness of her old life, the simple trust of strangers, the feeling of being part of a world larger than rumour and fear. Yet she could not regret her path, not when Lise smiled in her sleep, or when Halvard's knock at the door meant a quiet hour shared over tea and bread. Halvard's visits had grown more frequent since the sickness began. He brought Mira gifts from the forest, mushrooms, a brace of rabbits, sometimes a handful of wild strawberries. They spoke little, but the silence between them was companionable, free from the weight of judgment that clung to every word exchanged with others. One evening, as a red sun sank behind the trees, Halvard lingered on the threshold. "Folk are saying worse things, Mira," he said quietly. "Some think you're to blame for the madness." She set aside the pot she was scrubbing. "I can't stop them from talking. All I can do is help those who come to me." He nodded, running a hand through his hair. "You should be careful. There's fear in the air, too much for sense to stand against it." Mira managed a small, tired smile. "Thank you for the warning, but I have always lived with fear, in one shape or another." Halvard shifted, as if searching for words. "If you need help, if they turn on you, I'll do what I can." The words warmed her, more than she could say. She pressed his hand in silent gratitude before he left, disappearing into the deepening night. After Halvard was gone, Lise appeared at Mira's elbow, hugging herself for warmth. "Are you scared?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mira considered her answer. "A little, but being afraid doesn't change what's right. I will stay and do what I can." Lise nodded, understanding more than her years should allow. She slipped into her cot, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. Before sleep claimed her, she spoke again. "I'll help too. I can gather water, or berries, or firewood. I'm not afraid." Mira brushed a stray hair from the girl's brow. "You're very brave, Lise, braver than most grown men I know." The fire burned low as Mira sat by its light, watching the embers fade and feeling just for a moment that she was not entirely alone. The next morning brought a knock at her door that was neither Halvard's nor Lise's. It was Father Soren. He stood in the dawn mist, robes dark against the pale light, a look of grave politeness on his face. "May I come in?" he asked, though he was already stepping across the threshold. Mira wiped her hands on her apron and nodded. "Of course, Father. Tea?" He declined with a wave, gaze sweeping the cottage, the orderly shelves, the simmering pot, the small figure of Lise still half asleep on her cot. "I come with concern for the village," Father Soren said. "People are unsettled. There is much talk of curses, of unholy influences." Mira kept her voice level. "I am only a healer. I work with what the earth provides." "Not all understand your ways," he replied. "Some believe you meddle in matters best left to God." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Is it a sin to ease pain, to help the sick?" Father Soren's eyes softened a fraction. "The line between faith and fear is thin, Mira. I hope for all our sakes that you do nothing to cross it." He left with a nod, boots crunching on the path. Mira watched him go, unease fluttering in her chest. She had faced worse than suspicion in her life, but suspicion was like a spark in dry grass. It could grow into fire with frightening speed. Later that day, Mira and Lise walked together in the woods, gathering rose hips and plantain leaves. The quiet under the trees soothed Mira's nerves. Here, surrounded by nature's slow patience, she could breathe. Lise darted ahead, her laughter echoing like birdsong, the weight of village gossip left far behind. They came upon a clearing where the air shimmered with sunlight. Mira knelt, pointing out the difference between safe herbs and poisonous ones, showing Lise how to dig gently so as not to harm the roots. "I wish we could stay here forever," Lise murmured. "So do I, little one, but even the safest place cannot last forever." As they made their way back, Mira's thoughts turned again and again to Father Soren's visit, to Halvard's warning, and to the old ache in her heart, the ache of never truly belonging. The unease in the village deepened with every passing day. A sharp word in the tavern could start a quarrel, the smallest cough drew suspicious looks. At market old women clutched their rosaries more tightly, and children were forbidden to wander alone after sunset. The mood was not yet panic, but it simmered just beneath the surface. One night, as Mira sat stitching a torn sleeve by candlelight, a frantic pounding rattled her door. She opened it to find Edda, the widow, wild-eyed and breathless. "It's my boy," Edda gasped. "He's burning with fever, shaking so badly. I can hardly hold him." Mira threw on her cloak and followed Edda through the muddy lanes, Lise trailing behind. At the widow's cottage, the boy lay tossing and turning, sweat slicking his brow, breath coming in ragged bursts. His skin was flushed, his limbs jerking as if caught in a dream he could not escape. Edda wrung her hands, desperate. "Please, Mira, salve him." Mira worked swiftly, crushing willow bark for tea, bathing the boy's skin with cool water, murmuring words of comfort. Lise fetched more water, her small feet moving quickly, her face pale but determined. The night stretched long and tense. At last, just before dawn, the boy's fever broke and his breathing slowed. Exhausted, Edda collapsed in relief. "Thank you," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "If not for you—" Mira only nodded. She knew the boy was not yet safe, but she had bought him time. And she knew, too, that every success would be met with suspicion, every failure with blame. As she returned home, the sky pale with the coming day, Mira found Halvard waiting on her doorstep. "He's better?" Halvard asked quietly. "For now," Mira said, her voice hoarse with fatigue. Halvard glanced at the empty street, then back at her. "You should rest, but I think there's more trouble ahead. They're talking again, saying no one was so sick before you came." Mira met his gaze, anger flickering in her eyes. It's easier to blame a stranger than to accept that suffering comes for everyone. Halvard's mouth tightened. "They say the priest will call a council, that you may be summoned to answer for the sickness." "I have nothing to hide," Mira replied, but in her heart a seed of dread took root. That day Mira slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of home and exile, of voices rising in accusation. She awoke to find Lise sweeping the floor, her thin arms moving with determination. "You helped the widow's boy," Lise said quietly. "That means you're good, no matter what anyone says." Mira smiled, touched. "Thank you, Lise. Sometimes I forget." As the sun set, Mira prepared for the next wave of visitors. More villagers, Cammy an old farmer with a festering wound, a young woman dizzy with nausea, a man whose hands shook so badly he could not lift a cup. Mira treated each one, offering balm for their bodies and gentle words for their fears. But she could feel suspicion building outside her door. The headman passed by, pausing as if to speak, then moving on. Children's voices, once bright, now held an undercurrent of warning. Don't go near the witch's house. Neighbors who had once nodded in greeting now crossed themselves or looked away. That night, as Mira sat alone, she opened the battered book that was her only true inheritance. Its pages were filled with notes in her mother's hand remedies, prayers, stories from their homeland. Mira traced the faded ink, feeling the old comfort of remembered words. She read aloud, softly, in the language of her childhood, as if to call forth a blessing for herself and those she tried to help. But the wind rattled the shutters, and a chill settled in her bones. She knew the time of quiet healing was ending. The storm was coming. She could feel it in the heaviness of the air, in the silence of the woods, in the restless dreams that haunted the village. She closed the book and banked the fire. Tomorrow she would face whatever came. The following morning, the church bell tolled before sunrise, a harsh, urgent sound that sent crows flapping from the rooftops. Mira woke with a start, sensing trouble before she even opened her eyes. She dressed quickly, braided her hair with trembling fingers, and found Lise already awake, curled in the window nook with worry etched across her face. "What's happening?" Lise whispered. Mira tried to steady her voice. "They're calling a council. The whole village will be there." She packed her bag with the tools of her trade, evials of calming drops, a bundle of dried rosemary, a scrap of linen stained with elderflower tea. Halvard arrived before dawn broke, shoulders set and jaw clenched. "I'll go with you," he said quietly. "If there's trouble, you won't face it alone." Mira nodded, grateful beyond words. The village square was already crowded, the air thick with nervous anticipation. Father Soren stood at the steps of the church, flanked by the headman and a handful of stern elders. The villagers formed a loose circle, pressing forward with every new rumour, each whisper making the circle tighter. The headman's voice was low but firm. "We are gathered to speak of the illness that plagues us. Some say it is a curse, others a test from God. We must look for the cause." Eyes turned toward Mira. She felt the weight of their stare, suspicion, fear, a flicker of hope. Lise clung to her side, Halvard close behind. Father Soren raised his hand, calling for silence. "Let us not forget that Mira has healed many among us, but questions must be answered." A woman spoke, her voice trembling. "Why did the madness begin after she came? My son never suffered such terrors before." An old man spat at the ground. "It's her foreign ways. She brings spirits with her herbs and powders." Others argued, voices rising, blending into a cacophony of fear and desperation. Mira waited until the noise began to fade. When she spoke, her words were clear and calm. "Sickness comes to every place. I use only what I know: herbs, clean water, kindness. I cannot promise miracles, but I do my best for all who ask." A hush fell. For a moment, Mira thought the tide might turn. Then the butcher's apprentice shouted, "Let her prove herself. Let her heal the baker, or she's a witch." Father Soren hesitated. "We are not here for vengeance. We seek the truth. If Mira has knowledge that can help us, she should share it." Mira's heart pounded. She drew a slow breath, forcing herself to meet every gaze. "I will examine the sick, as always, but I ask for trust and time. Healing is never certain." Halvard stepped forward, his voice steady. "Mira saved my brother's life last winter. She has risked much to help us." Lise, small but fierce, spoke up as well. "She gives me food when I'm hungry. She is good. Please don't hurt her." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. For a moment, doubt warred with fear. After the council dispersed, Mira felt exhaustion sink into her bones. She returned to her cottage with Lise and Halvard, grateful for their presence. As dusk approached, she sat at her work table, hands shaking, thinking of the road that had led her here. Lise fetched a mug of tea and placed it beside her. "Will you have to leave?" she asked softly. Mira looked at the girl, her heart aching. "I don't know. I hope not." She opened her mother's old book, fingers tracing the faded words. A scrap of parchment slipped free and fluttered to the floor. Mira stooped to pick it up. It was a letter, written in hurried script, the mother's warning, sent years ago. "When fear takes root, it grows wild. Be careful, my daughter. The world is not always kind to those who heal." Mira closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had lived with fear for so long, fear of discovery, fear of failure, fear of being driven away once again. But looking at Lise and Halvard, she knew she was not alone. For now, that was enough. That night, as rain tapped gently on the roof, Mira sat awake by the fire, watching the embers fade. The old ache of exile still throbbed inside her, but it was softer, tempered by the knowledge that even in the darkest place, small kindnesses could kindle hope. She promised herself, quietly, that she would not run, not yet. The storm outside grew louder, but inside her cottage, for the first time in many weeks, Mira felt a fragile sense of belonging. The moon was nearly full, round and heavy as a silver coin in the sky. Its pale light spilled over the village, turning thatched roofs and muddy lanes to quicksilver and shadow. In the cool hush after midnight, the world felt suspended, each heartbeat carrying the weight of something inevitable. Inside her cottage, Mira barely slept. Dreams flickered just beyond reach, snatches of her mother's voice, the distant sound of waves, sharp bursts of laughter that twisted into cries. She woke before dawn, the air thick with the knowledge that nothing would be the same after tonight. Trouble began before the first light reached the village square. A scream shattered the silence, high and piercing, cutting through stone and wood. Mira sprang from her bed, pulling her shawl tight. In the growing light, she saw villagers stumbling from their homes, faces white with fear. At the baker's cottage, chaos reigned. The baker who had only days before raved at invisible spirits now thrashed in his bed, eyes wild, hands clawing at the sheets. His wife wept at his side, her cries thin and broken. Neighbors pressed in the doorway, shouting, arguing, begging for answers. Father Soren arrived, robes flying, clutching a heavy book. He pressed across to the baker's chest, murmuring prayers, but the man's convulsions only grew worse. "He's possessed," someone cried. "Call the healer," shouted another. "She's the cause of this," spat a third. Reluctantly, the crowd parted as Mira arrived. She knelt by the bed, examining the baker with brisk, practiced hands. His skin was clammy, lips blue, breath shallow. Mira reached for her bag valerian, poppy, cool water, but the crowd pressed closer, suspicion rising. "Let her fix him," someone jeered. "If she cannot, she must pay." Mira ignored the jibes, focusing on the man before her. She worked swiftly, forcing a tincture between his teeth, cooling his brow, whispering to him softly. The convulsions slowed, but the man remained delirious, eyes rolling back as he mumbled to unseen visitors. The villagers watched, hope flickering and dying, whispers thickened in the smoky air. When dawn finally came, the baker lay still, breathing shallow but alive. Mira stood, exhausted, sweat glistening on her brow. Father Soren spoke above the murmur, voice heavy with sorrow. "She has tried, but the evil remains. We must seek guidance." Someone shouted, "It's her foreign ways, her magic. She brings the devil to our doors." Another, "Before she came, our children laughed. Our bread was sweet now. Even the dogs go mad." The words spread like wildfire, fear igniting anger. Mira felt their hatred gather like storm clouds. The headman raised his staff. "Enough. We will not have mob justice. There will be a council tonight, after prayers." Mira returned home under escort, the villagers' eyes burning into her back. Halvard found her at the gate, jaw clenched with fury. "They want a scapegoat," he muttered. "They always do." "I know," Mira whispered. "I've seen this before." Lise hid in the shadows, refusing to leave Mira's side. She pressed her small hand into Mira's, trembling but defiant. "I'm not afraid," she whispered. "They're just scared." Mira squeezed her hand. "So am I, little one, but we'll face it together." All day the village simmered, doors slammed shut, old women crossed themselves. Even those Mira had healed kept their distance, fear battling gratitude. Mira prepared for the council, gathering her notes, letters, and her mother's book proof, if anyone cared to see, of her innocence. She could not eat, she barely drank. When dusk fell, she washed her hands and braided her hair as her mother once had, steadying herself with ritual. Halvard arrived before dark. "They'll want you to confess or to run," he warned. "I will do neither," Mira replied. "I will speak the truth for those willing to hear it." As the sun slipped behind the hills and darkness crept into the valley, the council gathered in the stone church. Candles sputtered on the altar, throwing trembling shadows across rough-hewn benches and the worn faces of the villagers. The air was thick with the scents of smoke, tallow, and fear. Father Soren stood before the altar, flanked by the headman and 3 village elders. Mira entered with Halvard at her side, Lise clutching his hand. The pews were packed farmers, craftsmen, mothers with babes on their hips, all drawn together by dread and curiosity. The headman's voice echoed in the hush. "We are here to seek answers, not vengeance, but the suffering in our village demands we look hard at the cause." A ripple ran through the crowd, angry and uncertain. Mira felt the weight of their stares like a chill on her skin. Father Soren raised his hands for silence. Let each speak in turn. A farmer rose, voice trembling. "My wife cannot sleep. My youngest cries at shadows. Never until he jerked his chin toward Mira, arrived among us." Others followed, a mother whose child raved at night, an old man who'd lost his appetite, a girl who claimed to see ghosts in the orchard. Each story twisted around Mira, weaving her into the village's misfortunes. "She poisons the air with her herbs," someone spat. "She brings spirits with her foreign prayers," whispered another. Through it all, Mira stood still, hands folded before her, listening. She recognized the shape of fear, the familiar drumbeat of suspicion. For years she had been the outsider, the stranger different enough to be noticed, but not enough to be understood. At last the priest turned to Mira. "What have you to say for yourself?" She stepped forward, her voice steady, carrying through the anxious silence. "I am a healer. I use what knowledge my mother taught: Meplants, water, patience, care. Illness is no one's fault, but it must be met with reason, not blame." A murmur of dissent rippled through the pews. One of the elders, a woman with a face lined by many winters, spoke. "You came to help. Some have grown better under your care, yet we are worse off than before." Mira met her gaze. "Sickness is not new to Heddle. There are years when the grain spoils, when fever runs through children, when shadows seem darker. But if you believe I am the cause, I cannot stop you." A young man, red-faced and angry, shouted from the back, "If she is innocent, let her prove it. Let her heal the baker now, tonight." Father Soren frowned. "It is not for us to command miracles." The headman interjected, "But it is for us to be wise. If there is proof, let us see it. If not, let us act before misfortune grows." A hush fell, as if all were holding their breath. Mira turned to the crowd. "I will try again, but if healing were certain there would be no pain in this world. All I ask is a chance." The council agreed. Mira would visit the baker at sunrise, in the presence of witnesses. Until then, she was not to leave her home. On the way out, Halvard squeezed her shoulder. "You spoke well." Lys whispered, "They're wrong. I know they're wrong." Mira smiled faintly, hiding her dread. "Whatever happens, you are both brave." They parted at Mira's door, the night thick with expectation. Inside, Mira packed her remedies and notes, hands shaking. She checked her mother's book one more time, seeking answers in the faded pages. Outside, the moon hung low, as if listening to the secrets of the village. She did not sleep, her thoughts twisting through memories of other places, other nights' villages that turned on strangers, kindnesses repaid with exile. But she steeled herself with the knowledge that she had done all she could. If this was to be her trial, she would meet it with her head held high. Dawn arrived, pale and uneasy, with low clouds blotting out the last stars. Mira dressed in silence, her hands steady now that the waiting was over. She wrapped herself in her oldest cloak, gathered her satchel of herbs and tinctures, and waited by the door as the first villagers approached. Lise pressed a rough woolen scarf into her hands, eyes shining with trust. Halvard and the headman met her at the gate, joined by Father Soren and 3 others chosen to witness. The group moved in grim procession to the baker's cottage, the path lined by villagers who watched from behind curtains and half-open doors. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and fever. The baker lay on his pallet, gaunt and grey, his breath shallow, eyes closed to the world. His wife knelt beside him, lips moving in silent prayer. Mira knelt by the bedside, her movements calm and deliberate. She inspected the baker's pulse, the sheen of his skin, the swollen joints of his hands. She asked for boiled water and prepared a tea from willow bark, mint, and valerian. With patient skill, she sponged his forehead, murmured soft encouragement, coaxed him to drink. The witnesses watched in wary silence. Father Soren offered prayers under his breath. The headman took notes on every word and gesture. Minutes stretched into hours. Slowly, the baker's breathing eased, the fever broke, his fingers unclenched. Mira checked his eyes and found awareness there clouded, but returning. At last, the baker's wife burst into grateful tears. "He's waking, he's coming back to me." For a moment, a hopeful hush settled in the room. One of the witnesses, a stoic elder, nodded slowly. "She has done no harm. If anything, she gives us hope." But not all were convinced. In the lane outside, angry voices rose. "She's tricking US witchcraft can heal as well as harm. Herb woman, go back where you came from." The mob's anger swelled, fed by fear and shame. Stones struck the walls. Curses flew like crows. Father Soren stepped outside, holding up his arms. "Enough," he called, voice ringing. "Mira has done only what she promised. If we lose our mercy, we lose ourselves." The headman spoke, his words heavy. "She will not be harmed. We must wait and watch. If any other fall sick, let her be called again." Mira stood, exhausted, the relief in her bones mixed with the ache of doubt. The council's verdict was not freedom, but a reprieve conditional, uncertain, fragile as morning frost. As she left the cottage, Halvard fell into step beside her. "You did it," he murmured. "For now," Mira answered. "They will look for another reason, another blame, but for today we have peace." Lise ran to her, hugging her fiercely. Mira knelt and embraced the child, letting herself feel the weight of all she had endured. That evening, in the quiet of her cottage, Mira reflected on the day. She had faced the council, tended the sick, and survived the storm of accusation. The village remained wary, shadows clinging to every wall, but she had earned a sliver of respect, a wedge of doubt against the darkness. She made a silent promise, looking out into the night. "I will stay as long as there is need. I will not let fear drive me away." And beyond the village, under the watchful moon, the forest breathed quietly. The worst was not over, but for the first time in many weeks, hope had room to grow. After the trial at the baker's cottage, a nervous stillness settled over Heddle. The villagers kept mostly to their own homes, doors shut tight, their eyes sliding away when Mira passed in the lane. Rumours still moved, but quietly, carried in half-heard conversations and sidelong glances. For a few days, at least, open accusation gave way to a more private suspicion. Mira poured her focus into her work. Each morning she woke before dawn, collecting dew from wild thyme and gathering new growth from the edge of the woods. She inspected her store's rowan berries, wormwood, foxglove, and angelica, testing for spoilage, rechecking every remedy and preparation. If there was poison in the bread or water, if some mold or rot was spreading madness, she would find it. Halvard continued to bring her word from the rest of the village. "The baker grows stronger," he reported one evening, "though some say it's only luck. There's a cough making its way through the children now." Mira nodded. "I'll send syrup for their throats. If it's the same sickness, we must know quickly." He hesitated, watching her as she measured honey into a pot. "You should rest. You look worn thin." She smiled, grateful for his concern. "I can rest when the fear passes. Until then, I have work." The small moments of comfort tea with Halvard, Lisa's quick laughter as she learned to recognize healing plants helped anchor Mira to this place. But her mind turned again and again to the questions that haunted her. What was the root of this illness? And what secret did the village, or perhaps even Mira herself, still keep? One afternoon, as she pounded willow bark into powder, Lise appeared with a muddy scrap of cloth in her hand. "I found this near the grain bins," the girl said, eyes shining. "It smells funny like rotten bread." Mira took the cloth and sniffed it. A sour, earthy scent stung her nose, a scent she remembered from long ago during another outbreak in a faraway city. Ergot, a deadly fungus, sometimes grew in rye and wheat after a wet summer. Its poison twisted minds, bringing nightmares, convulsions, hallucinations, and death. Her heart thudded with realization. She searched her memory for everything she knew. Ergot in bread could explain the fevers, the madness, even the convulsions. But the villagers would not understand such a thing, not yet. She mixed a tincture for the baker's wife and prepared a powder to be stirred into water for those most at risk. "This may help," she told Lise, "but it's not a cure. The bad grain must be destroyed, or the sickness will only return." Lise nodded, her expression fierce with resolve. "I can help spread the word. I can show people where you found the cloth." Mira squeezed her hand. "We'll go together. It's time the village heard another kind of truth." That night, as dusk painted the hills with bruised light, Mira and Lise walked to the church. Father Soren was there, alone, sweeping the steps. He looked tired, his shoulders bowed, his movements slow. "We need to talk," Mira said. She showed him the cloth, explained what she believed was poisoning the village. At first, Soren listened with wary skepticism. "You say the bread itself is cursed," he murmured, "not by spirits or witches, but by a mould?" Mira nodded. "A sickness in the grain, invisible and deadly. If you let me explain to the council, we can destroy the spoiled stores and spare the rest." The priest hesitated, eyes shadowed. At last he nodded. "We will meet at dawn. Bring your proof." The following morning, Mira stood before the village council, holding the scrap of mouldy cloth as if it were a holy relic. Father Soren had summoned the headman and elders, insisting the matter was urgent. Lise stood at Mira's side, small hands clenched, ready to speak if called upon. The council gathered in the open square, their faces drawn with suspicion and sleeplessness. A faint drizzle fell, muting voices and blurring outlines, but nothing could soften the sharpness in the air. Father Soren cleared his throat. "Mira has made a discovery about the sickness. She asks that you hear her out." Some grumbled, others nodded for her to continue. Mira held the cloth high. "This is not witchcraft or a curse. This is ergot, a mould that grows on wet grain. I have seen its poison before. It causes madness, fever, fits, and death. If you eat bread made from infected rye, you risk falling sick." A murmur ran through the crowd. The word mould meant little to most, but the idea that their daily bread was tainted was unsettling. The miller, a broad man with flour on his sleeve, stepped forward. "How do you know this? We've always eaten our bread, never had such trouble before." Mira met his gaze. "Last year's rains were heavy. If even a few sacks were left damp, the fungus could have spread. Let me show you bring the grain from your bins, and I will find the signs." The headman hesitated, but Father Soren nodded. Soon, villagers hurried to bring sacks from their homes and the common granary. Mira sifted through handfuls, showing them the dark, twisted kernel shard, misshapen, tinged with purple. She crumbled a bit into water and let the bitter scent rise. Some elders recalled old stories times when the bread went sour and people lost their minds. A grandmother whispered of dancing plagues and burning limbs from her childhood. Still, not everyone was convinced. "Why didn't this happen sooner?" demanded the cooper's wife. "Perhaps the witch planted it herself," muttered a farmer at the edge. Halvard's voice cut through the grumbling. You've all seen what Mira has done. She's healed the sick, risked herself when others turned away. Give her a chance to fix what's broken. The headman finally raised his staff. Enough. We will burn the tainted grain. Those who can will help Mira treat the sick. If she is right, we may see an end to this madness. If not... He left the threat unfinished, but Mira caught his meaning. The days after the burning of the grain passed in a strange, suspended quiet. For the first time in weeks, no one in Heddle spoke of curses, nor did any new sickness appear. Still, the memory of fear lingered, and its shadow clung to the villagers like the early morning mist. Yet peace was fragile. One afternoon, a distant cousin of the headman arrived from a neighbouring valley, bringing with him wild tales of a plague that had swept through his own village, of a healer's apprentice accused of witchcraft and driven away. The stranger spoke of signs and omens, of the dangers that followed when outsiders meddled in God's will. The stories spread through Heddle, rekindling old suspicions. It did not matter that Mira had helped save lives. It did not matter that the bread had been burned and the children's laughter had returned. Fear is a stubborn weed, it regrows where you least expect. Father Soren sensed the unrest, his sermons turning somber. We must hold to mercy, he urged, and judge not in haste. Evil can wear many faces, but so can good. But for some, the old anxieties were easier to trust than hope. Then, just before dawn on the second day after the stranger's arrival, a sharp cry cut through the village. The baker's wife, who had nursed her husband through his madness, ran into the square with terror in her eyes. "It's begun again," she screamed. "My daughter," she woke raving, clutching at her throat. "Please, someone help her." Within minutes the village was awake, lights flaring in windows, voices rising in panic. The crowd swelled outside the baker's home, arguments breaking out, some urging calm, others looking for someone to blame. Halvard forced his way through to Mira's door, pounding on it with his fist. "Mira, come quick, the fever's returned." She was already awake, already dressed, her bag of remedies in hand. Lise followed close behind, teeth clenched in determination. Together, they hurried to the baker's cottage. Inside, the child writhed on her blanket, eyes rolling, lips moving in fevered whispers. Mira checked her for injuries, found none, and pressed a cool cloth to the girl's brow. She mixed a quick tea mint, chamomile, a pinch of valerian and forced a little between the child's lips. Halvard stood guard at the door, keeping the anxious crowd at bay. "She'll recover," Mira promised, voice steady. "It's not the same sickness. There's no mold, no bad bread. This is a simple fever, nothing more." But panic cares nothing for reason. Outside, voices rose, old wounds reopening. "It's a sign," someone shouted. "She never should have stayed. Once a witch, always a witch. Drive her out before worse befalls us all." As sunrise broke, the church bell rang 3 slow, deliberate tolls, the signal for a village trial. Father Soren stood at the church steps, face grave. The headman stood at his side, the council gathering. Mira was summoned, along with Halvard and Lise. The crowd pressed close, the air charged with tension and dread. The headman's voice rang out, hoarse and tired. "We come together not in anger, but in need of truth. Our peace is broken again. We must judge what threatens us." Father Soren's eyes were kind but cautious. "Speak, Mira. Tell us what you know." She did not flinch. "The fever is real, but it is not the sickness that took us before. The bread is safe, the grain is burned. This is but a child's fever, dangerous, but not unnatural. Fear cannot cure what pain remains." A woman wept softly. A man muttered, "How can we know what's true?" The council debated, some siding with Mira, others with the mob. The stranger's stories echoed through the crowd, stoking old fears. The headman turned to Father Soren. "What is your judgment?" The priest hesitated, gaze resting on Mira, then Lisa, then the watching faces of his flock. Father Soren stepped forward, the church steps making a small stage above the crowd. His voice, though weary, held a deep resonance. I have seen much suffering and much healing. Mira has been both accused and praised. The truth lies not in fear, but in what we choose to see and remember. He looked into the faces of the villagers, searching for something: remorse, hope, or merely a willingness to listen. What happened to the baker's daughter is not a curse, nor a mark of evil. Children fall sick, even when the world is good. I have watched Mira work with honesty and skill. I have seen her risk herself for those in need. A murmur of dissent rippled through the crowd, but it was softer now, mingled with the shuffling of uncertain feet and the anxious glances of those who remembered what it was to be helpless. One of the elders, a woman with a scar down her cheek from an old farm accident, stood and spoke. I was among those who doubted, but my grandson lives because of Mira's hands. If we cast her out, who will heal us when the next sickness comes? Others joined in, voices timid but gathering strength. She helped my husband walk again. She sat up with my mother all night. My sister's fever broke after Mira's tea. Yet there were those unmoved, the old suspicions curling tight around their words. She's not from here. She knows things no decent woman should. What if the next sickness is worse? The headman raised his hand, calling for silence. Mira, do you have anything more to say? Mira stepped forward, her gaze sweeping across the assembly. I cannot promise an end to pain. I cannot force you to trust me. All I can do is what I have always done: treat the sick, share what I know, and hope that kindness is enough to change even a little of this world's fear. Her voice did not waver, though inside her heart hammered with uncertainty. Halvard moved to her side, standing openly for the first time. I have known Mira longer than most. She is honest, brave, and has done more for this village than any outsider ever would. I will vouch for her, as should any who have seen her work. Lise clung to Mira's hand, lifting her small chin with defiant courage. She's my family. You all know what she's done for me. There was a pausier moment when the world seemed to teeter, ready to fall into either mercy or ruin. Father Soren turned to the council. It is the right of this village to decide who belongs and who does not, but let it be said, if you send Mira away, you do so knowing you cast out not just a healer, but your own hope. After a long silence, the headman nodded. We will put it to a vote here and now. Hands were raised, first a few, then more, until a slim but decisive majority signaled that Mira should stay. A weight seemed to lift from the square. Father Soren stepped down, shoulders sagging with relief. The dissenters muttered and shuffled away. Mira felt Lisa squeeze her hand, and Halvard's presence solid at her side. For the first time since her arrival in Hedel, she felt something close to acceptance. The crowd began to disperse. The morning sun rose over the rooftops, and a sense of ordinary life returned. Children chased one another in the square, mothers called them home for breakfast, and the threat that had hung over the village seemed, for now, to ease. Mira thanked those who had spoken for her, offering quiet words and gentle touches. To the headman and Father Soren she said, I will continue my work as always, and ask only that I be judged by my deeds. The priest nodded, a tired smile in his eyes. That is all anyone can ask. As she turned to leave, the woman with the scar called out, Mira, my boy still coughs at night. When you have a moment. Mira smiled. Bring him by. There's a new syrup I want to try. Halvard and Lise walked with her, the three forming a small procession away from the church and into the brightening day. The worst, Mira hoped, was finally behind them. That afternoon Mira returned to her cottage, weary but lighter than she had felt in many months. Lise bounded ahead, gathering wildflowers along the path, while Halvard walked at her side, silent but content. Inside, the familiar scents of dried herbs and cooling tea soothed Mira's nerves. She set down her bag, washed her hands, and tended to the gentle routines that anchored her: boiling water, measuring honey, crushing thyme and mint for new remedies. Neighbours began to return, tentatively at first. The widow Edda brought her son, his cough persistent but his eyes clearer than before. Mira listened to his chest, offered a syrup, and sent them away with a basket of bread. The baker's wife arrived to thank her again, pressing a clutch of eggs and a soft "I'm sorry" into Mira's hands. Each visit, each word, chipped away at the invisible wall that had separated Mira from the others. She sensed the old suspicions would not vanish entirely and would everyone become a friend, but acceptance, she realized, did not require perfection. It only required time, patience, and a willingness to try again. That night, Halvard lingered by the fire, his gaze thoughtful. "They were right to let you stay," he said. "This village needs you more than it knows." Mira smiled, gratitude warming her voice. "And I need it too, in ways I didn't expect." Lise, already curled up on her cot, yawned and whispered, "We're a family now, aren't we?" Halvard nodded, reaching over to squeeze Mira's hand, the only kind that Matashosen, not born. For a while, the three sat in easy silence, watching the fire burn low, listening to the night settle around them. Outside, the sky was clear. No clouds, no omens, only the soft glow of the moon and the promise of peace. The next morning, Mira woke to laughter drifting through her window. In the square, the children played, their shouts bright and fearless. The baker's daughter waved as Mira passed, the scar of her illness fading. Mira walked the village, checking on the frail and healing, exchanging words with those she once only saw from a distance. Some greeted her warmly, others only nodded, but the air was changed a little less heavy, a little more open. At the edge of the woods, Halvard waited for her, a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. "For your window," he said, shy but sincere. She took them, their scent sharp and sweet. "Thank you," she replied, her heart full. In that moment Mira understood that belonging was not a single event but 1,000 small choices repeated day after day. It was the work of living and loving and healing not just wounds of the body but those of the spirit. The village had chosen to let her stay, and in staying, Mira chose them too. The summer dusk arrived soft and golden, settling gently over Hedal. There was a new hush to the villager-knot, the tense, watchful silence of fear, but a waiting that felt more like rest than worry. Lanterns glowed in windows, and the air carried scents of wildflowers and distant wood smoke. Life, bruised but unbroken, had found its slow rhythm again. Mira stood in the doorway of her cottage, breathing in the calm. The weeks since the trial had been busy. There were wounds to heal, gardens to tend, new recipes for medicines to try. She had helped a woman through a difficult birth, sat with an old man as he passed quietly into the next world, and taught Lise to recognize the difference between sweet and bitter root. Her days were full, and for the first time, she did not feel like an outsider haunting the edges of someone else's home. Lise had grown braver. She no longer flinched at every raised voice, and she laughed more freely, running wild with the other children. The girls' bond with Mira deepened, rooted in shared work and quiet trust. They tended the herb beds together, and at night Lise read aloud from Mira's battered book, her voice gaining confidence with each page. Halvard became a familiar presence, visiting after long days in the woods. Sometimes he brought gifts: fresh mushrooms, honeycomb, a carved wooden spoon. Sometimes he brought only himself, settling by Mira's fire in companionable silence. He was patient, steady, never pressing for more than she offered. Mira found herself looking for him in the crowd at market, listening for his quiet laugh, relying on his company as surely as she relied on the sun's warmth. But not everything was mended. Some villagers still avoided Mira, their faces pinched with memory and pride. The stranger from the neighbouring valley had left, but his stories lingered in corners, feeding the doubts that die slowest of all. And then, one restless night, new trouble arrived. A violent summer storm rolled in from the hills, rain lashing the roofs, thunder shaking the windows, lightning turning night to day and back again. Mira and Lise hurried to shutter the cottage, gathering candles and blankets in case the wind blew out the fire. They were nearly settled when there was a frantic pounding at the door. Mira opened it to find the miller's wife, soaked and breathless. "Please, Mira," she gasped. "My husband, he's hurt. A tree fell on him by the river. He can't move his legs." Mira did not hesitate. She gathered her bag bandages, splints, poppy syrup and followed the woman into the storm. Halvard, drawn by the commotion, joined them, grabbing his cloak and an axe. The rain made the world a blur of noise and motion. By the river, the miller lay in the mud, pinned by a heavy branch, moaning with pain. Mira and Halvard worked together in the cold dark, freeing the man and binding his wounds, using every trick she knew to keep him alive. When they finally hauled him to shelter, Mira spent hours cleaning and setting the broken leg, splinting it tight, promising she would do all she could. Lise brewed tea and built up the fire, her face pale but determined. "He'll live, won't he?" she whispered. Mira managed a tired smile. "He will, if we all do our part." By dawn, the storm had blown itself out. Word spread quickly. The miller would survive, thanks to Mira's care and Halvard's strength. People gathered at her door not in fear, but with offerings of thanks, bread, cheese, wild berries, even a bottle of honey, wine. The village, it seemed, had begun to remember not only what they feared, but what they owed. The days following the storm shimmered with a kind of fragile hope. In the village square, children played games among puddles left by the rain. Women gathered in small groups, trading stories and laughter, their voices lighter than before. The fields, long neglected during weeks of worry, bloomed again under calloused hands and cautious optimism. Mira found herself busier than ever, tending the wounded, checking on the frail, giving advice to anxious mothers and skeptical fathers. The miller's recovery was slow but steady. He learned to walk again with a carved stick Halvard made for him, and each step he took became a story passed from neighbour to neighbour. Mira saved his leg, you see. She never gave up, even when everyone else did. The change in mood was subtle but real. People began to greet Mira in the street, to call her name with thanks instead of curses. Some even stopped by her cottage for reasons other than illness, a question about a garden pest, a loaf of bread left at the door, a shy invitation to share in the midsummer feast. Still, the old wounds lingered. Mira felt them in the wary eyes of a few, in the tense silence that sometimes followed her laughter at the market. But she learned not to flinch, to let the small kindnesses take root and grow. One evening the headman himself came to visit. He brought a basket of apples and a letter stamped with the village seal. "I wanted to thank you," he said, awkward as a schoolboy, "for the miller, for the children, for everything." Mira took the apples, smiling. "I am glad to be of use." The headman cleared his throat. "There will be a festival soon. We'd like you to be there. As a guest, not just the healer." The invitation startled her, but she nodded. "I'd be honored." He hesitated, then handed her the letter. "And there's this, a petition signed by most of the village, asking for you to stay, for good." Mira blinked, surprised by the sudden welling of emotion in her chest. She took the letter with both hands, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she said softly, and meant it. The days sped by as preparations for the festival began. Lise threw herself into the work, weaving garlands of wildflowers, teaching the other children the names of herbs and roots. Halvard volunteered to help raise the maypole, his quiet strength an anchor for the younger men. On the morning of the festival, Mira awoke to sunlight streaming through her window. She dressed in her cleanest dresser gift from the baker's wife and braided her hair with rosemary and lavender. Lise skipped ahead, her dress patched but bright, eyes alight with excitement. The village green was transformed, hung with ribbons and lanterns. Tables overflowed with bread, cheese, roast meat, and early fruit. The air rang with music and laughter, the mood exuberant after so much sorrow. Mira was swept into the celebration, drawn into dances and stories, thanked again and again by those she'd helped. At midday, the headman called for silence. He stood by the maypole and gestured for Mira to join him. He spoke simply. There was a time when fear ruled us, but healing and courage have brought us back. Let us welcome Mira as one of our own, not because she was born here, but because she chose use and we chose her. A cheer went up. Halvard and Lee stood with her, their faces shining with pride. Mira felt tears prick her eyes, but she did not hide them. She looked around at the villagisher people know and saw acceptance reflected in their smiles. That evening, as dusk fell and lanterns glowed in the trees, Mira found herself walking at the edge of the green with Halvard. "You belong here," he said quietly. She squeezed his hand, hope blooming in her chest. "For the first time, I believe it." He stopped, turning to face her. "And if you ever wish for more for a life shared, not just survived, I am here. No expectations, only the promise that you will never be alone again." Mira searched his face, saw only truth there, and nodded. "Let's begin with this night," she said. "We have already come so far." As the festival stretched into night, laughter and music mingled beneath the stars. Lanterns bobbed on the breeze, their soft light illuminating circles of dancers, children chasing fireflies, elders sharing old tales. Mira found herself swept into a reel, her feet light, her heart even lighter. But just as midnight approached, a sudden shout cut through the merriment. A small group ran from the edge of the green. There was trouble at the river. A child had wandered off, chasing a runaway dog, and now both were missing. The music died at once. Without hesitation, Mira grabbed her cloak and hurried with Halvard, Lise, and others toward the riverbank. Torches flickered as villagers searched along the water's edge, voices tense with worry. It was Lise who found the dog first wet and barking, caught in the reeds. Mira scanned the river, her mind racing. Then she heard it a faint whimper, nearly lost in the current. "There!" Mira shouted, pointing to a tangle of fallen branches. Without waiting, she waded into the cold, knee-deep water, Halvard close behind. Together they pulled aside the branches, and Mira reached for the childer shivering boy, clinging to a branch, wide-eyed with terror but alive. "Hold on, love, I've got you," Mira soothed, lifting him free. Halvard steadied them both as they sloshed back to shore. Lise wrapped the child in her own shawl, murmuring comfort. Back at the green, the crowd erupted in cheers and tears. The boy's mother clung to Mira, overcome with gratitude. Someone began to sing a quiet, hopeful tune that others picked up, voices rising as relief spread through the gathering. Father Soren stepped forward, blessing the rescued boy, the river, and all who had helped. "Tonight, let us remember what fear cannot teach usually kindness, only courage, can bring us safely home." Mira stood among her neighbors, warmth and pride flooding her chest. For the first time, she truly felt not just accepted, but needed, woven into the fabric of village life. The night waned and the festival slowly faded, lanterns burning down to embers. Halvard and Lise walked home at Mira's side, silent in their happiness. At her cottage, Mira tucked Lise into bed, smoothing the girl's hair, whispering a blessing her mother once gave her. Halvard lingered by the fire, his presence grounding her as always. "You were brave," he said. "They all saw it." Mira shook her head, smiling. "So were you, so was Lise. Maybe bravery is just the choice to keep loving and helping, even when it's hard." Halvard leaned closer, his eyes kind. "Then let's be brave together." They sat by the window, watching the first silver blush of dawn rise above the fields, quiet and content. The seasons changed, as they always do. In the weeks after the festival, the village of Heddle found its stride again, fields tilled and sown, children growing strong, laughter rising with the morning sun. The wounds of fear did not vanish entirely, but they healed with the quiet patience of time and trust. Mira's days followed the gentle rhythm of belonging. She woke before dawn, swept the hearth, gathered fresh dew from her herb garden. Lise was never far away, eager to help, to learn, to test the limits of her new confidence. The girl had become the heart of the little cottage, her laughter brightening even the gloomiest morning. Halvard's visits became part of the daily pattern, sometimes with a brace of rabbits or a bundle of wild flowers, sometimes with nothing but the comfort of his steady presence. Mira grew to rely on his quiet humor and strength, the way he could calm a room simply by entering it. She found herself imagining him always at her side, not only as friend and protector but as family. The villagers came and went, no longer hesitating at Mira's door. Some brought gifts, eggs, wool, a scarf knitted for Lise. Others brought trouble sashes, coughs, quarrels to be soothed with patience as much as herbs. Mira treated all with equal care, her heart growing larger with every kindness offered and received. One cold morning, Father Soren arrived, his breath fogging in the frosty air. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, an uncharacteristic shyness about him. "Mira," he said, "I wanted to thank you for saving more than just lives. You helped us remember mercy. That's a harder thing to heal." She smiled, touched by the rare admission. "It was not my doing alone, Father. Fear is a stubborn sickness, but kindness, given time, always finds its way." He nodded, leaving her with a blessing and a small loaf of sweet bread, still warm from the church oven. Late one evening, as Mira finished writing in her mother's old journal, Lise appeared in the doorway. "Are you writing another recipe?" the girl asked, curiosity shining in her eyes. Mira laughed softly. "No, tonight I'm writing a story, your story and mine, about how we found a home." Lise curled up beside her, head on Mira's shoulder. "Can I stay with you forever?" Mira pressed a kiss to her brow. "As long as you wish, little one. Here you belong." Outside, the moon climbed high overhead Al, silvering the rooftops and painting every path with gentle light. Mira looked out her window and felt a sense of peace she had never known before, a peace earned not through luck, but through perseverance, forgiveness, and love. As months passed, the village's story wove on. New children were born, old feuds faded, and the memory of fear softened into a lesson retold by fireside on winter nights. The legend of the healer who had once been an outsider slowly transformed, becoming something gentler and truer, a tale of courage, forgiveness, and the ordinary magic of steadfast kindness. Lise grew under Mira's patient care, learning not only the names and uses of plants, but the subtler art of listening, of noticing what is needed and when to offer it. She ran wild with the other children by day, and in the evening sat beside Mira, copying remedies and stories into her own notebook. She no longer asked if she belonged, she knew it, as surely as she knew the path home in the dark. Halvard's place in their lives deepened, his strong hands carving toys for Lise and shelves for Mira's herbs. Sometimes, on quiet nights, he and Mira sat by the hearth and spoke of futures, of planting an orchard, of teaching others, of growing old in peace. Sometimes words were unnecessary. A glance or a gentle touch was enough. The cottage at the edge of the woods became a place of gathering. On festival days, its garden overflowed with laughter and music. Travellers sometimes stopped, seeking help or wisdom, or only a cup of tea. Mira welcomed all, remembering the sting of exile and the sweetness of acceptance. Father Soren continued his rounds, greyer and slower, but with a new lightness in his step. He often told the young, the village found its heart the day it learned to trust a stranger. There were still hard winters and lean harvests, still moments when doubt or sorrow threatened the fragile fabric of community, but each time the people remembered what they had survived together. They chose hope again and again, and Mira, once rootless, found herself rooted at last. She looked forward to the seasons turning, to teaching Lise and any who wished to learn. Her mother's buono thick with new notes and stories rested on the shelf, a living record of a life remade. On clear nights, Mira stood outside with Lise and Halvard, watching the moon rise above the fields. She would hold them close and whisper, "This is our home, this is where we belong." The world beyond Heddle would always be full of wanderers, of those searching for acceptance and peace. Mira hoped that somewhere, in some quiet corner, another healer might be welcomed, another village saved by courage and grace. And under the endless sky, with her family by her side, Mira was content the story, no longer one of exile, but of belonging, forgiveness, and hope. All that day, villagers gathered in the rain-soaked square, piling sacks of grain in the center. Mira and Lise worked alongside them, separating the good from the bad. The fires burned high, smoke curling into the sky as moldy kernels blackened and crumbled to ash. For some, the loss of food brought anxiety and resentment, but most were too weary for more fighting. Halvard organized a group to check wells and storerooms, while Mira distributed her tinctures and teas, explaining how to use them. The worst cases, those already feverish or mad, were kept inside, watched by family and volunteers. That night, as the last flames died, Mira sat by her window, watching the rain streak down the glass. She felt bone-tired but hopeful for the first time in weeks. Lise dozed nearby, wrapped in a patchwork quilt, her face peaceful. Halvard arrived late, mud on his boots, exhaustion in his eyes. The fires are out. Some folk grumble about lost bread, but the headman kept the peace. Mira poured him tea. It will take time. Some will heal, some may not, but at least the poison is gone. He nodded, silent gratitude in his gaze. Mira found herself speaking softly, almost to herself. There are places where the sickness was never understood, where healers like me were blamed and burned. Thank you, Halvard, for believing. He squeezed her hand, gentle and solid. You're not alone, Mira. Not anymore. Over the next days, the mood of the village slowly shifted. For the first time in weeks, there were no new cases of madness, and the fevers that lingered began to break. Children returned to the lanes, their games tentative at first, then growing louder as laughter reclaimed the square. The baker, thin and pale but smiling, walked arm in arm with his wife to Mira's door, offering a loaf of fresh bread and a wordless embrace of thanks. Some villagers were quicker to forgive than others. The cooper's wife still muttered curses when Mira passed, and a few neighbours clung to their suspicions, but the headman and Father Soren made their rounds with gratitude in their eyes. Mira tended the weak and ailing, her remedies now accepted without protest. Even the miller, once full of doubts, brought a bag of grain for Mira to test just to be sure. Halvard visited often, bringing stories from the woods, sometimes a handful of wild strawberries or a bundle of dry wood for her fire. The bond between them deepened, built not of grand gestures but of small kindness-essured silence, steady company, a look across the table that said, "I am here." Lise remained Mira's constant shadow, quick to fetch water or herbs, eager to learn, always watching with bright, clever eyes. One rainy afternoon, Mira found her poring over the battered book, lips moving as she tried to sound out the unfamiliar words. Mira smiled, feeling a fierce hope that the girl might grow up free of fear, more healer than outcast. Yet not all wounds healed so quickly. Some families mourned loved ones lost to the sickness, and the scars left by suspicion ran deep. Mira knew better than to expect complete trust history was not so easily rewritten. One evening, as Mira tidied her shelves, she discovered a letter tucked into her mother's old book, a letter she had not read in years. Its edges were worn, the ink faded, but still legible. She sat by the fire, reading. "Daughter, if you are reading this, I am gone. Remember that knowledge is both shield and weapon, and that those who fear what they do not understand may turn on you. But never let fear stop your hands from helping. You carry a gift, let it be your legacy, even when the world would silence it. Mira closed her eyes, letting the words settle into the spaces inside her that had ached with loneliness. She understood, finally, that healing was not just the work of herbs and hands, but of hearts and courage, of enduring when others turned away. The rains eased, and a golden evening arrived, soft light spilling across the fields, the air warm and clean. Mira, Halvard, and Lise stood at the cottage door, watching the village come alive again. The world was not perfect, not wholly safe, but it was moving toward the possibility of peace. Mira smiled, a quiet sense of purpose blooming within her. She was no longer merely the outsider, the stranger in the woods. She was a healer, and for now she belonged.